The burden of being heralded as the chosen one of prophecy was something that weighed on Anakin Skywalker's shoulders from the moment he was brought before the Jedi Council. Supposedly destined to bring ultimate balance to the Force, the Jedi believed that Anakin would fulfill the prophecy by destroying the Sith once and for all. Yet the true meaning of balance or the prophecy itself was interpreted differently by some, and that uncertainty would be reflected in Anakin's own path as he fell to the dark side and became the Sith Lord Darth Vader. Nowhere in the prophecy did it say that the Chosen One would be a Jedi, yet it would seem that Anakin would not bring balance to the Force at all as a Dark Lord of the Sith. Interestingly enough, Vader's own thoughts on the prophecy, his supposed role as the Chosen One, and the Jedi Order are explained in the Legends novel Dark Lord: The Rise of Darth Vader. A few weeks after his defeat on Mustafar, Vader meditated alone in his chambers, pondering all that had occurred during Order 66 and his confrontation with Padmé and Obi-Wan on Mustafar. He wondered if he should cast blame on Palpatine for his injuries, but then realized that it was only Obi-Wan who had sentenced him to the prison of his armor. He was sentenced by his wife and his alleged best friend, their love for him warped by what they perceived as betrayal. Obi-Wan was simply too brainwashed by the Jedi to recognize the true power of the dark side. Vader knew that Palpatine's machinations and his own defection to the Sith had been essential to bring peace to the galaxy, essential to place power in the hands of those resourceful enough to use it properly, in order to save the galaxy from itself, to end the incompetence of the Senate, to dissolve the bloated and entitled Jedi Order, whose masters were blind to the decay that they had fostered. Vader wondered why he, their chosen one, had seen the truth, yet they had refused to follow his lead by embracing the dark side. He thought that the Jedi were simply too set in their ways, too inflexible to adapt. Vader's rage grew inside as he thought of the prophecy and of the Force itself. He had simply wanted to save everyone, yet they were too blind to see it. In the end, everyone had failed to recognize his true power, to accept that he knew what was best for them. Instead, Vader was stripped of everything he once was, left without a purpose. Vader cursed the Force, wondering what it had ever brought him but pain, torturing him with premonitions, visions that he was unable to prevent, leading him to believe that he had great power and was destined to bring balance, when he was really little more than the Force's servant. But Vader promised himself that he would be a servant no longer. Through his own strength and the power of the dark side, he would render the Force subservient to him. Vader then thought to himself that while Anakin Skywalker had died on Coruscant, the Chosen One had truly died on Mustafar. Now, I think that this look into Vader's mind is incredible, and it's why I recommend that every single fan read this book. I think that Vader's thoughts could be interpreted a couple different ways. Perhaps he viewed his role in destroying the Jedi Order and forming the Empire as him fulfilling the prophecy and balancing the Force. Maybe Vader believed that it was the Jedi that needed to be destroyed and not the Sith in order to bring balance. Or perhaps Vader was so bitter and full of self-pity that he blamed the Force itself for his pain, and he renounced the prophecy and his role as the Chosen One. Either way, it's fairly clear that after the rise of the Empire, Vader either considered the prophecy fulfilled or didn't care about it at all, meaning that he did not consider himself to be the Chosen One, since he told himself that the Chosen One had died on Mustafar. Although he had renounced his former identity as Anakin Skywalker, hoping to fully embrace the dark side of the Force during the reign of the Empire, Darth Vader never managed to fully vanquish Anakin. The sacrifices that he had made, the things he had lost, and the horrible acts that he had performed inflicted deep psychological turmoil on him. He existed in a constant state of depression and emotional pain, as well as perpetual physical agony. Secretly in his mind, he grieved over the consequences of his decisions and mourned the loss of Padmé, entering dreamlike visions of an alternate reality where he had never betrayed the Jedi. With the Sith destroyed by his own hand, Anakin became the youngest Grandmaster of the Jedi Order. Padmé gave birth to their son, Jin Skywalker, and became the Supreme Chancellor of the Republic. Vader would use these dreams of a false reality to keep himself sane during his everyday life, begging Padmé to help him as he suffered through the reassembly of his cybernetic limbs and the use of his life support armor. While in the real world, he tried to focus on all of his rage and hatred in order to become more powerful through the dark side. However, his mind still truly held on to his love for Padmé, increasing his psychological instability and his emotional distress. In 19 BBY, a few months after the end of the Clone Wars, Vader was summoned before the Emperor and tasked with locating Grand Moff Tarkin's son, Garrosh, who had gone missing while battling insurgents in the Atoan system. Vader departed Coruscant along with 2 battalions of the 501st Legion and headed for the Atoan system. He began his search for Tarkin's son on the planet Atoa, and after encountering local resistance organized by the natives, Vader met an Atoan priestess named Lady Sorrow, who offered to help them find who they were searching for. Lady Sorrow did not offer her assistance without a price, and she insisted that in exchange, Vader support her bid to become queen of the Atoan system. While he was initially enraged at her request, he could not harm her since she was his only lead, and he agreed to her terms. Thus, Lady Sorrow directed Vader to the location of Garrosh Tarkin's missing Star Destroyer. When Vader launched a rescue attempt with his forces on the unknown planet, he found himself ambushed and betrayed by Atoan insurgents, under the orders of Lady Sorrow. His soldiers suffered massive casualties, and although Vader managed to kill many of his attackers, he found himself overwhelmed and severely injured in an explosion. He was then captured alive by the Atoans. When he awoke, he found himself restrained and in the presence of Garrosh Tarkin. Vader asked why he was still alive, and Tarkin replied that Lady Sorrow had said that Vader would somehow be able to will himself back from the dead, and she hoped that he could still be turned to join their cause. Tarkin explained that he had joined Lady Sorrow's ranks shortly after he had been assigned to wipe out the insurgents of the Atoan system, and he planned to rule by Lady Sorrow's side. As Tarkin left him alone, Vader was suddenly struck by a vision of Padmé. She called him Anakin and said that she knew he would one day destroy them both, remarking how broken he now was. Vader replied that he was only what his masters had made him, deflecting blame for the consequences of his actions, and Padmé said that self-pity did not suit him. He became angry, telling her not to speak the name Anakin again, that Anakin was gone and had died with her. Turning, Padmé replied that there was no one there for her then, and she left. Hysterical, Vader screamed for her to come back, finding the strength to break from his restraints and proceed into the cathedral. He searched down darkened tunnels until he found Padmé again, hooded and waiting for him. She said that she had never left him, but he retorted that she did leave when she died. Removing her hood, Padmé revealed her face, decayed by death, and she corrected that she did not die, he killed her. Dropping to his knees, Vader was overcome with grief, and he finally admitted that he had killed her himself. Confronting the truth, he said that he had also killed Anakin and their unborn child, and that he hated himself for what he had done. Padmé referred to him as his Sith title now, and said that she forgave him, which caused Vader to shed a single tear for everything that he had lost. She vanished once more, causing Vader to become hysterical again as Garrosh Tarkin and Lady Sorrow revealed themselves. Vader realized that Lady Sorrow had somehow induced the visions, and she explained that she simply possessed the ability to see and let others see, which allowed Vader to speak to Padmé's spirit. He demanded that she bring Padmé back, but Lady Sorrow refused. Instead, she attempted to redeem Vader by appealing to his human side, asking that he spare their lives and the life of their unborn child. While Vader initially hesitated, he ultimately decided to kill them and leave his fate up to the will of the Force, and he used his powers to bring the entire cathedral crashing down on top of them. Days later, Vader awoke to find himself on Coruscant, having his cybernetics repaired in the presence of the Emperor. Palpatine was impressed that Vader had survived, and praised him for the results of the mission. The insurgents had been destroyed, and Grand Moff Tarkin believed that they had killed his son, making him an even better and more focused servant of the Empire. As Vader's cybernetics were attached, he did not need to imagine Padmé any longer, and he told his master that the power of the dark side gave him all that he needed. Fully suited in his repaired armor, Vader dropped to one knee, awaiting new orders from his master. As enemies, Anakin Skywalker and Count Dooku clashed many times during the Clone Wars. Anakin's hatred of Dooku even pushed him closer to the dark side over the course of the 3-year conflict, as Dooku had orchestrated assassination attempts against Padmé and taken Anakin's arm on Geonosis. In their final confrontation, Anakin was able to use that hatred, bolstered by his fear of losing Obi-Wan and his anger over his lost arm, to defeat Dooku and execute him. There was a much larger significance to that defeat, however, as Anakin cemented himself as Dooku's replacement as the Sith apprentice of Darth Sidious. After becoming the Sith Lord Darth Vader, during the early days of the Galactic Empire after the end of the Clone Wars, one of Vader's first missions was to Serenno, Dooku's homeworld. There, Vader decided to take further revenge against the Count by punishing the Dooku family and all of the other great houses in an event that would come to be known as the Cleansing of Serenno. Vader summoned the heads of Serenno's great houses and their eldest sons to meet with him as a representative of the Empire, where Vader marked them all as traitors for supporting Count Dooku as he led the Separatist forces, for which they needed to answer for. The head of House Borgin protested, insisting that Dooku's position had made it impossible for them to defy him. Borgin said that Dooku possessed a formidable will and unmatched skills of persuasion, and that the other families had had no choice but to support him during the Clone Wars. Vader retorted that there was always a choice, stating how Aiden Dooku and his mother had gone into exile when Count Dooku had resumed his title on Serenno after leaving the Jedi Order, and any of them could have done the same, but did not. Vader then announced that they would be offered a choice. Each heir of a given house would assume the title of head of their house by killing the current title holder, and if any refused, all would die. Vader ignited his red lightsaber to emphasize his seriousness. All of the families immediately protested as the crowd shouted simultaneously, insisting that Vader's demands were preposterous. Aiden Dooku told Vader that the idea was barbaric, to which the Sith Lord coldly replied that the rest of the galaxy had suffered, so Serenno would too, with its houses being cleansed by blood. It was Rodas Borgin, heir to House Borgin, that acted first, drawing a knife from his belt and plunging it into his father's back as he yelled in anguish. For a moment, they all watched the elder Borgin's body fall, and then the slaughter began. The heirs of each house brutally murdered their fathers. Afterwards, they were all forced to kneel in the blood they had spilled and swear fealty to the new head of House Dooku, Count Aiden Dooku. Vader had only spared Aiden Dooku's life because he had been raised away from Serenno in hiding for most of his life. With Aiden Dooku acting as the liege lord over all other great houses on Serenno, the leadership of the planet was brought under the control of the Empire. The rest of the galaxy never learned the truth of Vader's actions there, or what really happened during the cleansing of Serenno. After the rise of the Empire, stripped of everything he had once been, Darth Vader existed only to serve Darth Sidious. His psyche cleaved in two by the dark side, Vader became a creature controlled by rage. Struggling to embrace his new existence as a Dark Lord of the Sith, Vader found himself obsessed with locating and destroying any Jedi that had survived Order 66, something that Sidious didn't approve of. In the Legends book Dark Lord: The Rise of Darth Vader, this is a major focus, as Vader hunts down a group of Jedi survivors. Interestingly enough, this book reveals how and why Vader finally let go of his obsession with the Jedi, and lost his need to hunt them so viciously. As I mentioned, Sidious was disappointed with Vader's obsession with the Jedi. He told his new apprentice that the Jedi meant nothing to them, including Yoda and Obi-Wan. Sidious knew that dozens of Jedi must have survived the Purge, and that over time, Vader would indeed kill them. But to Sidious, the only important thing was that the Jedi Order as a whole had been destroyed. By hiding and running for their lives, the surviving Jedi humbled themselves before the Sith, and Sidious intended to let them, as atonement for 1,000 years of arrogance and self-absorption. But Vader did not agree. He believed that any surviving Jedi were major threats to the new Empire, and that Sidious was simply too blind to the fact because he had been victorious in his grand plans. Vader knew that some Jedi, the ones still devoted to their code and blinded by duty, would attempt to band together and restore the Order. Eventually, Vader found the Jedi he had been hunting on Kashyyyk, and a major conflict erupted between Imperial forces and the Wookiees. This is where it gets really interesting. Vader's greatest desire had been to catch the group of Jedi and kill them all, but in truth, Sidious was manipulating his apprentice yet again, hoping that Vader would learn an important lesson on Kashyyyk. When Vader defeated the Jedi Master Roan Shern, instead of killing him quickly, he took the time to speak to Shern. Shern, knowing that he was about to die, requested that Vader tell him the truth about the Clone Wars and Darth Sidious. So, Vader revealed that Emperor Palpatine was Sidious. Not only that, but he also told Shern that he was once the Jedi Knight Anakin Skywalker, the Chosen One. As Shern lay dying from his injuries, grappling with the revelation that the Sith Lord before him was Skywalker, Vader felt a deep change within himself, like a newfound satisfaction and closure. He was glad that Shern would die, knowing that the Jedi Order was betrayed by one of its own. More important, Vader's bloodlust had been appeased, replaced by self-possession of a sort he had never experienced. It was as if he had crossed some invisible threshold to a new world. He could feel the power of the dark side surging through him like an icy torrent. He felt invulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with his Durasteel prosthesis or his suit of armor. Interestingly, it had taken another Jedi to usher him over that threshold. Sidious sensed this change in Vader and was pleased. Now that Vader had begun to tap deeply into the power of the dark side, his true apprenticeship could begin. Later, aboard his Star Destroyer, Vader observed the galaxy. The Jedi no longer mattered to him. They were no different from other enemies who would interfere in the business of the Empire. His mission was only to maintain order, so that the dark side could continue to reign supreme. Anakin was gone, a memory so deeply buried he might have dreamed it rather than lived it. Just as Sidious had promised, Vader was now fully married to the Order of the Sith, and needed no other companion than the dark side of the Force. He embraced all that he had done to bring balance, by dismantling the Republic and destroying the Jedi, and he reveled in his new power. There would come a day where he and Sidious would be equals, and Vader would take an apprentice of his own to help him topple Sidious from his throne. The thought gave Vader something to live for. Contrary to popular belief, force healing is not something that Lucasfilm created recently. While the first times that we saw it used on screen were in The Mandalorian and The Rise of Skywalker, the ability to heal injuries with the Force has been part of the expanded Star Wars lore for decades. There's even an old Clone Wars book called Jedi Healer, and one of Luke's students in the Legends Jedi Academy trilogy was a healer that saved Mon Mothma from a poisonous disease with the Force. But anyway, this video isn't about them, it's about Darth Vader, and possibly one of the earliest examples of Force healing in Star Wars. This lore comes from 1996's Shadows of the Empire, the Legends book that told the story of what happened between episodes 5 and 6. Keep in mind that this book released before the prequel trilogy, so this is even before we knew exactly what happened to Vader to cause all of his injuries on Mustafar. Suffering greatly for the rest of his life and relying on bacta-tanks and his hyperbaric chambers, Vader was unable to heal himself completely using any medical methods. That's why he would attempt to heal his injuries not with bacta or other surgeries or cybernetics, but with the Force. Specifically, as a Sith Lord, he attempted to use the dark side of the Force, which is incredibly interesting. Before we jump straight into the scene with Vader from Shadows of the Empire, I want to examine what we know about Force healing, at least in Legends, in order to align with this book, using the encyclopedia Jedi vs. Sith: The Essential Guide to the Force. I think this will add a good amount of insight and understanding into Vader's attempts through the dark side specifically. The ancient Jedi learned that the power of the Force could be used to ease pain, heal wounds, and cure various afflictions, and that these healing arts were effective on all living beings. As with other Force powers, some Jedi had a natural ability as healers, though it was uncommon. Some Jedi could even use a Force technique called the Art of the Small, producing natural antitoxins by manipulating things at a molecular level. Other Jedi had learned to place themselves into trances for long periods of time to accelerate the healing process. Notice how all of these healing methods refer to Jedi, meaning they flow through the light side of the Force. Now let's take a look at what Vader attempted to do through the dark side. Darth Vader sat naked inside his hyperbaric medical chamber. The interior lighting was turned off, and he was free of the armor that he had to wear to sustain himself in public. The Force was powerful. Vader thought the dark side even more so, but he had never been able to use it to heal his badly burned body to the extent that he wished. That he was alive at all was something of a miracle, but he had somehow failed to master the energies needed for complete regeneration. He believed that it was possible, that with sufficient meditation and training, he would someday be able to rebuild himself into the man he had once been. Physically, at least. He would never go back to what he had been mentally: weak, foolish, and idealistic. Anakin had been much like Luke Skywalker was now, mere potential. He decided it was time for another test. Vader waved his hand over the motion-sensitive controls in his chamber. The spherical chamber opened, and the lid lifted with a hydraulic hiss and escape of pressurized air. He sat exposed to the surrounding room, unprotected by the super-medicated and oxygenated field inside the chamber. He concentrated on the injustice of his condition, on his hatred of Obi-Wan, who had made him so. With the anger and hatred, the dark side of the Force permeated Vader. For a moment, his ruined tissues altered. His scarred lungs and dead cells and constricted passages smoothed out and became whole. For a moment, he could breathe as normal beings breathed. His sense of relief, his triumph, his joy at being able to do so drove the dark side from him as surely as a light chases away shadow. The dark side eagerly consumed anger, but it was poisoned by happiness. It left him, and when it did, he could breathe no longer. Vader waved his hand, and the half-dome lowered and sealed him into the chamber once again. He had achieved it briefly, as he had done several times before over the years. The trick was to maintain it. He must not allow himself to feel relief, but must somehow cling to his rage even as he healed. It was difficult. He had not purged all of Anakin Skywalker, that blemished and frail man from whom he had been born. Until he did, he could never give himself over totally to the dark side. It was his greatest weakness, his most terrible flaw. A single spot of light amid the dark that he had been unable to eradicate over all the years, no matter how hard he tried. Vader sighed. He would have to try harder. He could not afford any weaknesses given his enemies, and more especially, given his friends. So I just think that this passage is incredibly interesting and really expands upon what we know about the dark side. I think most people would assume Force healing is an ability that can only be used through the light side of the Force. After all, the dark side is corruption of the Force. It only affects the user negatively and can even disfigure them physically over time. To see that Vader had actually managed to use it to heal himself on multiple occasions is fascinating. But given what we've seen other Sith Lords do, it's not that far-fetched. If Maul was able to use his anger and hatred through the Force to survive being cut in half, why wouldn't Vader be able to heal his lungs? I feel that this ability through the dark side is somewhat similar to the Sith alchemy that we've seen across both Legends and canon, like Vitiate being able to drain other life forces and live for 1,000 years, or Palpatine maintaining his consciousness in clone bodies. But overall, the most interesting part is how Vader was unable to maintain his anger and therefore his connection to the dark side in order to make the healing permanent. Since he felt relieved and even happy whenever he did heal himself, the healing would reverse immediately as the dark side withdrew from him. I think that's so interesting, specifically for Vader, because it shows that there was that small part of Anakin always inside of him. Anyway, let me know what you guys think of this story. Do you think Force healing through the dark side should be possible, or should it be something that only the light side grants? How do you feel about Vader being able to heal himself completely as opposed to Maul surviving being cut in half? During his time as a Jedi Knight, Anakin Skywalker was regarded as one of the best swordsmen within the Order. As the Padawan of Obi-Wan Kenobi, Anakin inherited a plethora of knowledge in the traditions of lightsaber combat, allowing him to incorporate elements from many masters of the past into his swordplay. By the time of the Clone Wars, Anakin achieved mastery of Form 5. However, his skill in Gem So was not enough to defeat Obi-Wan on Mustafar once he had become Darth Vader. After suffering gruesome injuries and being placed inside his life support suit of armor, Vader's lightsaber skill was never the same as it was. However, he did learn to overcome his physical limitations, developing his own hybrid form of lightsaber combat. But before we dive into his time as Vader, it's important to understand just how skilled Anakin was as a Jedi, and what exactly the specifics of Form 5 were. As Anakin progressed in his training, both variants of Form 5, Xian and Gem So, became his preferred styles. Form 5 had been developed as an improvement on the defensive Form 3, Sorisu, which required users to wait for an opportunity to strike instead of creating their own openings. The creators of Form 5 instead focused on using powerful attacks and quick counterattacks. Xian was considered the classical variant of Form 5, and focused on blocking blaster bolts. Gem So was developed later, and was specifically intended for use in lightsaber combat. Both variants were designed to use an opponent's attack against them, as Xian allowed for directing blaster bolts back at their origin, and Gem So prioritized immediate counterattacks after a defensive move. As Anakin progressed quickly through his training, his natural skill fed his ego, to the point that he even considered himself to be as good as Grandmaster Yoda. His skill in Xian served him well during the Battle of Geonosis, as he defended against blaster fire from an army of droids. However, Anakin was humbled when he faced Count Dooku. Reverting back to Form 5 after he briefly wielded two lightsabers and utilized Form 4, Ataru, Anakin was able to face Dooku even longer than Obi-Wan was, but was defeated and lost his arm. During the time of the Clone Wars, Anakin spent years developing and honing his skills with a lightsaber, focusing mostly on Gem So. As he utilized it more frequently, using brute strength and aggression to dominate his enemies, Anakin drew on his negative emotions constantly, pushing him progressively closer to the dark side. This reached a tipping point when he confronted Dooku for the final time, and after tapping into his anger and fear, he was able to defeat the Sith Lord and sever both of his hands. Before Dooku died, he realized that Anakin was the finest master of Gem So that he had ever seen. Once Anakin fell to the dark side, becoming the Sith Lord Darth Vader, his mastery of Gem So was brutally bolstered by the power of the darkness, and he became a terrifying warrior. However, that raw power was not enough to defeat his former master on Mustafar, and his aggression became his most fatal flaw. Vader was younger, stronger, and possessed more raw power in the Force than anyone, yet he lacked the experience and focus that Obi-Wan had. Obi-Wan was also the definitive master of the defensive form Sorisu, and Vader's mounting emotions, such as his frustration with being unable to penetrate Obi-Wan's defense, caused him to become distracted as their duel went on. He began making mistakes, and his clouded judgment eventually caused him to make the crucial error of attempting to jump over Obi-Wan, leading to the loss of his limbs and his immolation on the lava bank. After being reborn and adapting to his new suit of armor, Vader initially relied on only his physical strength and bulk provided by the armor, utilizing a clumsy method of stiff vertical strikes with his lightsaber. Through sheer power, he sought to wear down his opponents, similar to Anakin's use of Gem So, but not refined at all. Vader sought to quickly overcome the physical limitations of his armor, developing a version of Gem So that incorporated the elements of many different forms. Instead of attempting to fight against his bulky armor, Vader fought with it, using its weight and powerful cybernetics to deliver blows with incredible strength. With the new hybrid form that he developed, Vader utilized killing blows, demonstrating incredible precision and speed. Although the added weight and bulk of his armor typically caused him to refrain from practicing the acrobatics of Ataru, Vader was still fully capable of doing so when he needed to. As he utilized his new form over time, he sometimes opted to fight one-handed, employing a version of Form 2, Makashi, that relied on precision, using his prosthetics to maintain immense power in his strikes. When he was forced onto the defensive, he would switch to his own variation of Sorisu, keeping his elbows at his sides and holding his blade straight out in front of him, which protected his vulnerable chest box. While he utilized his hybrid form to great effect, Vader also learned from his mental mistakes in lightsaber combat, mastering his emotions while fighting. He no longer allowed himself to be blinded by rage, instead attacking with determination and relentlessness bolstered by the power of the dark side, allowing him to become a terrifying Dark Lord as he mastered his ultimate lightsaber form. When Anakin Skywalker returned home to Tatooine, desperate to save his mother from an uncertain doom, he met the Lars family. Shmi had been purchased and then freed and married by Klieg Lars, and it was Klieg who told Anakin of the terrible fate that had befell his mother when she was abducted by Tusken Raiders. Obviously, Anakin was too late to save her from death, and his wrath was unleashed upon the entire Tusken camp. One detail that isn't touched on in the film is Anakin's feelings towards the Lars family afterwards, and how his anger would come to fruition with the death of Owen and Beru at the hands of Imperial stormtroopers. Insane details are provided in the Legends book The Rise and Fall of Darth Vader, showing Anakin's internal rage and Vader's brutality. When Anakin arrived back at the Lars homestead with his mother's blanket-wrapped body, Klieg, Lars, Owen, Beru, Padmé, and C-3PO emerged from the entry dome. They watched in silence as he lifted his dead mother from the bike and carried her toward the dome's doorway. Anakin was in no mood to talk, and he had reconsidered his assessment that the Lars family was made up of good people. Anakin asked himself, what was the advantage of being good if you were weak? His grim, scowling expression locked on to Klieg Lars, who lowered his gaze. Anakin angrily thought that perhaps Klieg was wishing he hadn't given up on Shmi so soon. Without breaking stride, he redirected his glare to Owen and Beru. The two of them must have never been taught how to take care of things. Anakin didn't even look at Padmé or C-3PO as he descended with his mother into the underground dwelling, his resentment for the weak Lars family at a boiling point. That rage that he felt and the blame he cast upon them would resurface again, as Darth Vader and the Empire pursued the stolen Death Star plans on Tatooine. After meeting with Imperial leaders aboard the Death Star, Vader was informed that he had an incoming transmission from the Tatooine system. He had already been notified that Commander Praji's stormtrooper squad had learned that the Tantive 4's missing escape pod had carried 2 droids to Tatooine's surface, and that the droids had been picked up by a Jawa sandcrawler. Vader walked over to a communications console, where a holo projector flickered to life and projected an image of 2 fully armed Imperial sandtroopers standing beside a middle-aged man and woman who wore robes and were kneeling on the ground. Near the 4 figures, there was a partial view of a structure, which Vader recognized as an entry dome for a desert dwelling. Vader ordered the Sandtrooper squad leader to report, and was informed that the Jawas had sold 2 droids to the moisture farmers they had captured. Intrigued, Vader examined the holograms of the kneeling couple and asked for their names. The Sandtrooper responded that they were Owen and Beru Lars. The resolution of their holograms was clear enough that he could make out their worn, weathered features. Neither of them appeared to be comfortable having blaster rifles aimed at their backs. Remembering how they'd looked on the day Anakin Skywalker had met them, Vader thought that the years and Tatooine's twin sons had not been kind to them. He resolved that it was time for them to pay for their repeated weaknesses. When the Sandtrooper asked for Vader's orders, the Dark Lord replied that they could extend to the farmers every courtesy they had showed the Jawas, and then continue their search in the nearby spaceports. He also commanded that the troopers not stop transmitting until he broke the connection himself. Vader watched as the Sandtroopers carried out his brutal orders on their helpless victims, executing Owen and Beru with their blasters and then burning their bodies with flamethrowers. He found the sight of the rising flames, even holograms of flames burning light years away, to be most satisfying. When the Lars family homestead had been transformed into an inferno and Vader was pleased, he deactivated the holoprojector and left the room. So honestly, this is just an insane detail that adds some incredible weight to Owen and Beru's death, as well as Luke's story in the original trilogy. It brings up the question as to if Luke ever found out that Vader was directly responsible for having Owen and Beru killed. Would Luke have been able to forgive his father for that too? How would that information have changed things if Luke found out during the original trilogy? Darth Vader's injuries he suffered on Mustafar were incredibly extensive, as his entire body was practically ruined and he needed to rely on his life support armor to survive. While it is graphically shown that he burned alive, the true extent and severity of his injuries isn't blatantly explained in the films. However, in the Legends book Dark Lord: The Rise of Darth Vader, there is an entire scene from Vader's perspective, revealing his thoughts on his injuries and his armor. Vader stood for a long moment with his sheathed arms dangling at his sides, his head mournfully bowed. To the galaxy at large, Jedi Knight Anakin Skywalker, the hero with no fear, the Chosen One, had died on Coruscant during the siege of the Jedi Temple. And to some extent, that was true. Anakin is dead, Vader told himself. And yet, if not for events on Mustafar, Anakin would sit now on the Coruscant throne, his wife by his side, their child in her arms. Instead, Palpatine's plan could not have been more flawlessly executed. He had won it all: the war, the Republic, the fealty of the one Jedi Knight in whom the entire Jedi Order had placed its hope. The revenge of the self-exiled Sith had been complete, and Darth Vader was merely a minion, an errand boy, allegedly an apprentice, the public face of the dark side of the Force. While he retained his knowledge of the Jedi arts, he felt uncertain about his place in the Force. And while he had taken his first steps toward awakening the power of the dark side, he felt uncertain about his ability to sustain that power. How far he might have been now had fate not intervened to strip him of almost everything he possessed, as a means of remaking him. Or of humbling him, as Darths Maul and Tyrannus had been humbled before him, as indeed the Jedi Order itself had been humbled. Where Darth Sidious had gained everything, Vader had lost everything, including, for the moment at least, the self-confidence and unbridled skill he had demonstrated as Anakin Skywalker. Vader turned and began to move from the room. But this is not walking, he thought. Long accustomed to building and rebuilding droids, supercharging the engines of landspeeders and starfighters, upgrading the mechanisms that controlled the first of his artificial limbs, he was dismayed by the incompetence of the medical droids responsible for his resurrection in Sidious' laboratory on Coruscant. His alloy lower legs were bulked by strips of armor similar to those that filled and gave form to the long glove Anakin had worn over his right arm. What remained of his real limbs ended in bulbs of grafted flesh, inserted into machines that triggered movement through the use of modules that interfaced with his damaged nerve endings. But instead of using Durasteel, the medical droids had substituted an inferior alloy and had failed to inspect the strips that protected the electromotive lines. As a result, the inner lining of the pressurized bodysuit was constantly snagging on places where the strips were anchored to knee and ankle joints. The tall boots were a poor fit for his artificial feet, whose claw-like toes lacked the electrostatic sensitivity of his equally false fingertips. Raised in the heel, the cumbersome foot gear canted him slightly forward, forcing him to move with exaggerated caution lest he tumble or topple over. Worse, they were so heavy that he often felt rooted to the ground, or as if he were moving in high gravity. What good was motion of this sort if he was going to have to call on the Force even to walk from place to place? He may as well have resigned himself to using a repulsor chair and abandoned any hope of movement. The defects in his prosthetic arms mirrored those of his legs. Only the right one felt natural to him, though it too was artificial, and the pneumatic mechanisms that supplied articulation and support were sometimes slow to respond. The weighty cloak and pectoral plating so restricted his movement that he could scarcely lift his arms over his head, and he had already been forced to adapt his lightsaber technique to compensate. He could probably adjust the servo drivers and pistons in his forearms to provide his hands with strength enough to crush the hilt of his new lightsaber. With the power of his arms alone, he had the ability to lift an adult being off the ground. But the Force had always given him the ability to do that, especially in moments of rage. What's more, the sleeves of the bodysuit didn't hug the prostheses as they should, and the elbow-length gloves sagged and bunched at the wrists. Gazing at the gloves now, he thought, this is not seeing. The pressurized mask was goggle-eyed, fish-mouthed, short-snouted, and needlessly angular over the cheekbones. Coupled with a flaring dome of helmet, the mask gave him the forbidding appearance of an ancient Sith war droid. The dark lenses that covered his eyes filtered out light that might have caused further injury to his damaged corneas and retinas, but in enhanced mode, they reddened the light and prevented him from being able to see the toes of his boots without inclining his head almost 90 degrees. Listening to the servo motors that drove his limbs, he thought, this is not hearing. The Medroids rebuilt the cartilage of his outer ears, but his eardrums, having melted in Mustafar's heat, had been beyond repair. Sound waves now had to be transmitted directly to implants in his inner ear, and sounds registered as if issuing from underwater. Worse, the implanted sensors lacked sufficient discrimination, so that too many ambient sounds were picked up, and their distance and direction were difficult to determine. Sometimes the sensors needled him with feedback, or attached echo or vibrato effects to even the faintest noise. Allowing his lungs to fill with air, he thought, this is not breathing. Here, the Medroids had truly failed him. From a control box he wore strapped to his chest, a thick cable entered his torso, linked to a breathing apparatus and heartbeat regulator. The ventilator was implanted in his hideously scarred chest, along with tubes that ran directly into his damaged lungs, and others that entered his throat, so that should the chest plate or belt control panels develop a glitch, he could breathe unassisted for a limited time. But the monitoring panel beeped frequently and for no reason, and the constellation of lights served only as steady reminders of his vulnerability. The incessant rasp of his breathing interfered with his ability to rest, let alone sleep. And sleep, in the rare moments it came to him, was a nightmarish jumble of twisted, recurrent memories that unfolded to excruciating sounds. The Medroids had at least inserted the redundant breathing tubes low enough so that, with the aid of an enunciator, his scorched vocal cords could still form sounds and words. But absent the enunciator, which imparted a synthetic bass tone, his own voice was little more than a whisper. He could take food through his mouth as well, but only when he was inside a hyperbaric chamber, since he had to remove the triangular respiratory vent that was the mask's prominent feature. So it was easier to receive nourishment through liquids, intravenous and otherwise, and to rely on catheters, collection pouches, and recyclers to deal with his waste. But all those devices made it even more difficult for him to move with ease, much less with any grace. The pectoral armor that protected the artificial lung weighed him down, as did the electrode-studded collar that supported the outsized helmet, necessary to safeguard the cybernetic devices that replaced the uppermost of his vertebrae, the delicate systems of the mask, and the ragged scars in his hairless head, which owed as much to what he had endured on Mustafar as to attempts at emergency trephination during the trip back to Coruscant aboard Sidious's shuttle. The synth skin that substituted for what was seared from his bones itched incessantly, and his body needed to be periodically cleansed and scrubbed of necrotic flesh. Already he had experienced moments of claustrophobia, moments of desperation to be rid of the suit, to emerge from the shell. He needed to build, or have built, a chamber in which he could feel human again, if possible. All in all, he thought, this is not living. This was solitary confinement, prison of the worst sort, continual torture. He was nothing more than wreckage, power without clear purpose. When Darth Vader laid his trap for the rebels on Bespin, hoping to lure Luke in, he was also reunited with C-3PO, the droid he had built in his youth as Anakin Skywalker. There were few relics of the past that reminded Vader of his life as Anakin, yet 3PO was one of them that remained. Fans have wondered if Vader had recognized the droid on Cloud City, and at least in the Legends continuity, there is an answer. In the comic series Star Wars Tales and the book The Rise and Fall of Darth Vader, it's revealed that Vader did recognize 3PO when he was presented with the droid's broken parts. As Vader and Boba Fett waited while the Imperials took their positions around Cloud City, they received word that one of the rebels' droids had fallen behind and stumbled upon a stormtrooper squad. The troopers had destroyed it, but luckily Leia, Han, and Chewie had not heard. Enraged, Vader commanded them to bring the droid to him at once, as its memory could contain valuable information. The lieutenant returned quickly with an open-topped container that held the captured droid's parts. The limbs had been torn from the torso, and a tangle of multicolored wires stuck out from the droid's neck socket. Lieutenant Shekel stated that the damage was extensive, and that the droid was probably made a long time ago, as he held up 3PO's head for Vader to see. Vader took the droid's head and examined it closely. Despite the wear and tear to the head, Vader recognized a few small details that indicated Anakin Skywalker's handiwork. He gazed into the decapitated droid's blank photoreceptors. It was C-3PO. The last time Vader had seen the golden droid was on Mustafar, as he recalled how he had seen 3PO through the window of Padmé's ship as it landed. Holding this relic of his former life, Vader felt waves of anger and loss sweep over his dark soul. His memory flashed to the day that Anakin had found the droid's skeleton in Watto's junkyard, and Anakin had wondered if the repaired droid might help him and his mother leave Tatooine. Vader wondered whether C-3PO remembered anything of Anakin Skywalker. He doubted it. If the droid had had any knowledge of Anakin in his memory banks, then he would have shared it with Luke. But Vader was certain that Luke still remained ignorant of his father's true identity. As he looked into the droid's eyes, Vader thought that he should have left it in the scrapyard all those years ago. He had the sudden urge to crush the droid's head, but then realized that Lieutenant Shekel and Boba Fett were watching him closely. When Shekel inquired if he should have their technicians recover the droid's memory, Vader replied that the droid was useless and ordered them to destroy it. Returning 3PO's head to the container, Vader left the room, ordering Boba Fett to follow him as they prepared for their meeting with Lando Calrissian. The next day, after capturing the rebels and sensing that Luke was on his way to rescue them, Vader was informed that 3PO's parts had been found in Princess Leia's chambers. He was displeased that his order for the droid's destruction had not been fulfilled, and Lieutenant Shekel informed him that Chewbacca had retrieved the droid's parts, perhaps suggesting it was very important. Reaching into the storage bin, Vader picked up the droid's head again. Despite his desire to leave all of Anakin Skywalker's memories buried, another one surfaced, something Shmi Skywalker had told her son after she allowed him to keep the droid parts he had recovered. She told him that unless he was prepared to care for something, he didn't deserve to have it. Under his helmet, Vader winced at the memory. Watching Vader, Shekel asked again if the technicians should search the droid's memory, or if they should destroy it. Vader seemed to continue contemplating the droid's head, holding it closer to his helmet so he could see his dark, distorted reflection on the weathered gold surface of 3PO's lifeless face. He then slowly returned the head to the bin. Vader instructed Shekel to deliver the box to Chewbacca's cell. Shekel was very confused, and Vader mysteriously elaborated that he was giving the Wookiee what he deserved, before exiting the room to interrogate Han Solo. Darth Vader's armor was designed to protect and sustain the Sith Lord after his defeat on Mustafar. The suit acted as a life support system, encasing him completely and separating him from the outside world. While the suit was uncomfortable and incredibly painful, eventually Vader learned to live with it. The technology of the suit and cybernetics was outdated and was purposefully poorly made by the Emperor. This was to ensure that Vader would always be restricted and he could never try to overthrow the Emperor. The suit itself was incredibly sensitive to electrical charges, meaning that the Emperor could completely immobilize and hurt Vader with Force lightning if he needed to. With all of the shortcomings and weaknesses of the suit, one question is, why did Vader never upgrade his suit over time? He wore the same version of armor for over 20 years, yet he never changed it to be more comfortable or stronger. Or did he? First, before we get into the upgrades, I'd like to include a portion of a past video that explains Vader's injuries and the function of his suit in detail, to really give an understanding of just how poorly made the suit was. As Vader adjusted to life in his suit, he would bitterly think to himself that every one of his movements were abominations, and he was dismayed by the incompetence of the medical droids that had rebuilt him into the armor. For his mechanical legs, the droids had used an inferior alloy instead of durasteel, and they failed to inspect the strips of metal that covered the electrical wiring. As a result, the inner lining of his suit would constantly snag on his knee and ankle joints as he walked. The boots of his suit did not fit the mechanical feet, and they were raised in the heel, leaning him forward and forcing him to move with caution so he didn't stumble or fall over. It was so difficult for him to walk that he needed to call upon the Force for assistance, which infuriated him. His mechanical arms restricted his movement too, and they inhibited him so much that he couldn't even raise them above his head. While Vader knew that he could adjust them to deliver enhanced physical strength, he was not impressed by that, since he had always possessed the ability to crush anything through the power of the Force. He felt a seething hatred for his mask and helmet, which he despised the design of. He felt that it was needlessly angular, and with the helmet attached, he had to look down at almost a 90-degree angle just to see his feet. Because his eardrums had melted on Mustafar, sound waves were transmitted through implants inside his mask, but they distorted everything and made it sound as though he was underwater. Because the audio sensors were poor at distinction, Vader found it incredibly difficult to determine the distance and direction of whatever he was hearing. Despite all of these limitations and failures, he considered the biggest flaw to be his breathing apparatus. From the control box that stabbed through his chest, a thick cable entered directly into his torso, connecting his respirator and a heartbeat regulator. His chest also housed an implanted ventilator, with tubes running directly into his scorched lungs and into his throat. This additional tubing allowed for him to breathe unassisted for a limited amount of time if his suit ever encountered a glitch or stopped working. Now, in regards to Vader not upgrading his suit, there is a specific explanation given in the Legends book Death Star. In Year Zero, Vader was given the opportunity to have a new suit built for him, essentially acting as a 2.0 version of his old armor. The new suit would have been much more advanced, technologically superior, and more comfortable than his original armor. However, in order to be placed into the new suit, he would have to have his prosthetics and his life support systems disconnected and disabled for an extended period of time. Since the process of transference between suits was considered very risky and most likely would result in his death, he decided not to proceed. While this is essentially the main reason that Vader never upgraded to a new suit of armor, there is another reason he had for enduring the agony of his original armor. The perpetual pain and the anger it caused him made him stronger in the dark side. By being isolated from the world and existing in a constant state of distress, Vader was able to focus solely on honing his power in the dark side of the Force, which is exactly what Palpatine intended for him in the armor. After losing his second Jedi lightsaber to Obi-Wan on Mustafar, Darth Vader was forced to build a new one to use as a Sith Lord during the reign of the Empire. One interesting detail is how similar Vader's saber looked to Anakin's first lightsaber, which is something that is explained in the Legends books Jedi Quest and Dark Lord: The Rise of Darth Vader. To understand why the sabers are so similar in design, it's important to first know the origin of Anakin's first lightsaber and how he built it. I've actually already made a previous video explaining this full story, so I'll insert a clip here just for context, but I'll also add a card if you'd like to watch the full video. Anakin sat on the ground, listening to Obi-Wan's guiding words, and began to construct the lightsaber. However, once Anakin closed his eyes, Obi-Wan's form vanished and changed, becoming the Sith Lord Darth Maul.
Did I startle you? Perhaps you need to work on those Jedi reflexes. You're almost as clumsy as Qui-Gon Jinn.
Anakin prepared to battle the Spectre, reaching for his training saber, yet Maul snatched it with the Force, sending it into the wall and destroying it. He tossed Anakin a new lightsaber, taunting him and stoking his rage.
Why do you fear your anger? Why do you fear your hate? Perhaps you're afraid your new toy won't work. I can feel it. You hate me. It is natural after all. I gutted your friend like an animal.
Igniting the saber that Maul had given him, Anakin engaged the Vision in a lightsaber duel. As their blades clashed, Anakin wrestled with his own anger as Maul taunted him relentlessly.
You see what anger can do. It gives you power. It is something you can use like a weapon. You thought the same thing a moment ago. Why deny it?
Anakin, remembering his Jedi teaching, resisted the dark urges of the Vision. He told Maul that he would let his anger go, and he did not seek power because he was a Jedi.
Then you lie. How else will you save the poor mother you abandoned if you do not have power?
Anakin sliced through the specter, but the blade did no harm.
Don't you remember, boy? I am just a vision. Your vision. I am the master you secretly want. The dark side can deliver what you most desire. Admit it.
Finally, Anakin was able to banish the Vision, though the specter of Maul insisted that he would return, and that darkness would always remain in Anakin's soul. Sitting among the crystals and finally alone, Anakin looked down and saw that he still possessed the saber that the Vision of Maul had given to him. Obi-Wan found him in the cave, and after assuring Anakin that he was indeed real, he inspected the lightsaber. Anakin explained that he must have constructed it while he was in a trance, and that he didn't remember fashioning it. He also chose not to tell Obi-Wan about the Vision of Maul. So, Anakin built his first lightsaber during a trance in the dark side, where it was given to him by a specter of Darth Maul. That's a very important detail to remember. Now, 1 week after the events of Order 66, Vader built his new Sith weapon in the shadow of the Death Star, as Sidious had instructed. His master had provided him with the synthetic red crystal that would power the blade, along with his own lightsaber to serve as design inspiration. However, Vader thought of Sidious' saber as an antique and was not fond of its design. While he could appreciate his master's weapon, he preferred a weapon with more ballast. Vader was determined to please Sidious in this test, and he had tried to create a saber that was novel. Instead, in his meditative trance of construction, he had fashioned a black version of the first lightsaber he had wielded in his youth as Anakin Skywalker. With a thick, ridged hand grip, dual-phase focusing crystal, and forward-mounted adjustment knob, down to every minute detail, his new Sith hilt mimicked Anakin's first. Vader was disappointed and longed for the day when memories of Anakin would finally fade from his heart. So, because Anakin had originally constructed his first lightsaber during a vision through the dark side, when he went to construct his Sith lightsaber as Darth Vader, the final hilt looked exactly the same. It's just an amazing connection across these legend stories, expanding upon Anakin's fall to the dark side of the Force. Thank you guys for watching this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed it, and may the Force be with you.